The kitchen smelled like burnt toast and expensive cologne, and that combination alone should have told everyone in that room everything they needed to know about the marriage of Cassian Voss and Nyara Ashcroft. He stood by the marble island in a tailored charcoal suit, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something one of his golf buddies said, while she moved behind him in a plain gray sweater, quietly wiping crumbs from the counter he had just scattered without noticing. She had been awake since 5. He had rolled out of bed at 7, expecting coffee already poured, eggs already plated, silence already arranged around him like a service he'd paid for. "Nyara," he said, not even turning around, "did you press my blue shirt? It's hanging in the closet. The blue one, not the navy one. I have the Kessler dinner tonight, and I am not showing up looking like some mid-level analyst." She didn't answer. She had already pressed both, because she always anticipated the version of him that would forget what he'd asked for 5 minutes after asking it. This was the rhythm of their 14 years together. Cassian speaking in demands dressed as questions, Nyara answering in actions instead of words, because words, she had learned early on, were currency he liked to spend against her. 3 friends were coming for brunch that morning. Old money friends, the kind who measured a woman's worth in the cut of her diamond and the silence of her opinions. Cassian liked an audience. He liked, more specifically, an audience in front of which he could perform the version of himself he wished were true. Successful, self-made, generous enough to have married a woman with nothing to offer but a pretty face and a good work ethic, as he'd once described her at a dinner party, laughing like it was a compliment. Nobody in that kitchen, not Cassian, not his friends, not even the housekeeper who had worked for them for 6 years, knew that the woman quietly rearranging fruit on a porcelain platter had built, from a spare bedroom in a stolen weekend 11 years earlier, one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms on the eastern seaboard. Nobody knew that 4 floors below a nondescript building in a city 2 hours away, a company bearing her late grandmother's maiden name held government contracts worth more than Cassian's entire investment portfolio. Nobody knew that on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, when Cassian believed his wife was seeing a grief counselor about her late mother, Nyara was instead sitting at the head of a boardroom table, approving budgets that funded the salaries of 412 employees who had no idea their CEO went home each night to a man who called her hobby a nice little distraction. And nobody, least of all Cassian, knew that Nyara Ashcroft also held something else. Something older. Something that had nothing to do with code or patents or venture capital. Something that had been waiting, patiently, in the hands of trustees and lawyers, for the day she would finally decide to claim it. The doorbell rang at 11. Cassian answered it himself, arms already spread for an embrace before the door was fully open. "Marcus! Elaine! Come in. Come in. Nyara's got brunch ready." Elaine kissed Nyara's cheek and immediately turned her attention to the granite countertops. "Cassian, this kitchen is stunning. Did you have it redone?" "Had to," Cassian said, pouring mimosas with theatrical flourish. "Can't have my wife working in some outdated kitchen all day. Keeps her busy, keeps her happy." Nyara set down the platter of fruit without a word. "Keeps her busy." As though her days were empty vessels he had generously filled with granite and stainless steel. As though 412 people didn't report, in some fashion, up a chain that ended with her signature. "So Nyara," Marcus said, settling into a bar stool, "Cassian tells us you used to dabble in something technical. Programming, was it?" There it was. Dabble. She felt the word land somewhere behind her ribs, familiar as an old bruise. "Something like that," she said, and refilled the orange juice. "She was good at it too," Cassian said, warmly, generously, the way a man praises a child's drawing before hanging it on someone else's refrigerator. "But you know how these things go. Life happens. Priorities shift." He reached over and squeezed her shoulder, and to anyone watching it would have looked like affection. To Nyara, it felt like a hand placed on a door to make sure it stayed shut. She smiled, because smiling cost her nothing and revealed nothing, and she had spent 14 years perfecting the architecture of that particular silence. Somewhere in that silence lived every insult she had swallowed, every dollar of the household budget she'd quietly supplemented without his knowledge through a shell account he'd never thought to check, Every night she'd driven 2 hours home from board meetings and slipped into bed beside a man who believed she'd been folding laundry. Cassian did not know, could not have imagined, that the woman he called worthless in front of his friends had, 3 years ago, quietly acquired 41% of the very real estate holding company that managed the building his fame rented office space in. He did not know that if she wanted to, she could make one phone call and watch his entire fame scramble to find a new headquarters within 90 days. He did not know because she had never once let him see the size of the door behind which she lived. That was Act 1 of her life, the version everyone believed. The quiet wife, the pretty face, the good work ethic wasted on nothing in particular. But there was a second empire, and a third act coming, and Cassian Voss, sipping his mimosa and laughing at his own joke about his wife's abandoned hobby, had no idea he was standing at the very beginning of the end of everything he thought he owned. 2 hours north, in a glass tower that caught the afternoon light like a blade, a very different woman sat at the head of a boardroom table she had inherited but never announced. Zephira Arden was 42 years old, and she had spent the last 6 years of her life performing a magic trick so complete that even her own husband didn't know it was happening. In public, she was Lucien Drayke's wife, elegant, decorative, dutiful, present at every gala in a dress selected to complement his suit, applauding from the front row while he accepted awards for development she had quietly financed through channels he never bothered to trace. In private, in a boardroom 4 floors above the city, she was chairwoman of Housewife and Kestrel Logistics, a conglomerate her father had built from 3 shipping trucks into a global network moving goods across 41 countries. Her father had died believing his daughter understood something most heirs never grasped. That power announced too early gets challenged, undermined, dismantled by people who resent seeing it in the hands of someone who didn't fight publicly for it. So he had built her a trust, dormant, silent, activating only under conditions she alone controlled, and told her, on his deathbed, let them underestimate you for as long as it serves you, Zephira. The day it stops serving you, you'll know. And when that day comes, you won't hesitate. That morning, in the boardroom, the quarterly numbers were strong. Shipping volume up 6%. New contracts secured in 3 additional ports. A logistics AI system, greenlit under her signature 18 months earlier, now saving the company $40 million annually in route optimization. The board, 12 men and women who had watched her grow from a shy 19-year-old shadowing her father to a woman who now asked questions sharper than half the executives in the room, nodded in quiet approval as she closed the folder in front of her. Anything else? She asked. Silence. Then the CFO, a soft-spoken man named Aldous Reyes who had known her since she was a teenager, cleared his throat. Just one thing, chairwoman. Off the record. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. How is Lucien? The question landed the way questions like that always did, carefully, respectfully, but unmistakably loaded. Aldous had known her father. Aldous had watched the trust get drafted. Aldous, more than anyone else in this room, understood exactly what her husband did not. Lucien, she said evenly, is Lucien. Nobody pushed further. They didn't need to. The board had learned, over the years, to read the careful stillness in her voice the way sailors read weather, a subtle shift in pressure that meant something was building, even if the sky still looked clear. That night, Zephira attended a charity gala for pediatric cancer research, wearing a gown Lucien had selected for her, deep emerald, cut to draw eyes, paid for with money that, unbeknownst to him, ultimately traced back to her own accounts through 3 layers of corporate structure he'd never once questioned because questioning it would have meant admitting he didn't fully understand where his own wealth came from. Lucien stood at the podium that night, accepting an award for the Halvorsen Riverside redevelopment, a project Zephira had personally approved, personally financed through the conglomerate's real estate arm, and personally overseen through 4 architects he'd never met. This project, Lucien said into the microphone, his smile wide and practiced, represents everything I believe about building not just structures, but communities. I want to thank my incredible team, my investors, and of course, he gestured toward the table where Zephira sat, hands folded, expression composed into the practiced neutrality she'd perfected over 2 decades, My beautiful wife, who supports me every step of the way." The room applauded. Zephira smiled and lifted her champagne glass, and if anyone at that table had looked closely, they might have noticed that her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Supports him." As though she was scaffolding. As though the entire Riverside redevelopment hadn't been born in a boardroom she chaired, funded by a company he had no equity in, executed by professionals who answered, ultimately, to her. Later, in the car home, Lucien loosened his tie and exhaled with the satisfaction of a man who believed the night had gone exactly as it should. "Good crowd tonight," he said. The Hendersons were impressed. "I think we'll get the coastal contract." "That's wonderful," Zephira said. "You should smile more at these things, though. You looked a little stiff up there." "I'll work on it." "I mean it, Zephira. People notice. It reflects on me." She looked out the window at the city passing by in long ribbons of light, and she thought, not for the first time, but with a clarity that felt new, felt sharper, felt like something finally settling into place after years of drifting, that Lucien Drayke had spent 6 years of marriage believing he had built an empire with a decorative wife standing quietly beside him, when in truth he had spent 6 years standing quietly beside an empire that had simply allowed him to believe he was its architect. Neither Cassian Voss nor Lucien Drayke knew each other. Their wives had never met. Their companies existed in different industries, different cities, different orbits entirely. But their stories, though separated by geography, were bound by the same invisible thread. Two men who had built their entire identities on the assumption that the women beside them were smaller than they were, quieter than they were, less than they were. And two women who had spent years, patiently, silently, deliberately, building the exact opposite truth. If you're already sensing where this story is headed, you're not wrong. But stay with it, because the way these two women finally step into the light is unlike anything you've seen in this genre before, and the moment the husbands realize the truth is coming faster than either of them can prepare for. Drop a comment below telling us which woman's marriage feels more familiar to you, Nyara's or Zephira's. We read every single one, and it shapes the stories we tell next. And if stories about quiet power and women who build empires in silence speak to you, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next act will change how you see every worthless woman you've ever underestimated. Nyara's Tuesdays had a rhythm Cassian never questioned, because he never asked. She would leave the house at 7, dressed in the soft, unremarkable clothes of a woman heading to therapy, a cardigan, flat shoes, hair pulled back, and she would drive not to the grief counselor's office she'd once actually visited, years ago, after her mother's death, but to a private airstrip 40 minutes outside the city, where a small chartered plane waited to take her to the headquarters of Ashcroft Sentinel Systems. She had built the company from nothing but code and stubbornness. 11 years ago, in the spare bedroom of the house she and Cassian had just bought, she'd stayed up past midnight writing security architecture for a fintech startup that couldn't afford a name-brand firm. That contract led to another, then another. She'd used her grandmother's maiden name, Ashcroft, for every filing, every contract, every piece of correspondence, partly out of superstition and partly because some instinct in her, some quiet animal part of her mind, had understood long before she consciously admitted it that Cassian could never know. Not because she was ashamed, because she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent years cataloging a man's insecurities, that the moment he knew, he would find a way to make it about him. By the time the plane touched down that Tuesday morning, her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya who had been with her since year 3, was already waiting with a tablet full of updates. "Morning, Ms. Ashcroft. We closed the Meridian contract. Full 6-year term, government tier clearance." "Good," Nyara said, taking the tablet. "What about the breach simulation results from the Kestrel account?" 98% detection rate. Slightly better than projected. Nyara nodded, scanning the numbers with the same calm precision Cassian had once mistaken for coldness, back when they were dating and she'd still occasionally let him glimpse the sharpness underneath her softness before learning, through painful trial, that sharpness in a woman was something he found threatening rather than impressive. The Kestrel account. She paused on the name for half a second, some flicker of recognition brushing past her attention before she filed it away and moved on to the next item on the agenda. She didn't know, not yet, that Kestrel was short for Voss and Kestrel, that somewhere 2 hours north, a woman living a mirror version of her own hidden life was, at that very moment, reviewing the same contract from the opposite side of the table. The boardroom at Ashcroft Sentinel held 11 people that morning, and every one of them referred to her simply as Ms. Ashcroft, never suspecting that the composed, precise woman leading the meeting went home each night to a man who introduced her at parties as someone who used to dabble in something technical. "We have an opportunity," she told the room, "to expand into predictive threat modeling for logistics infrastructure. Ports, shipping networks, freight tracking systems. They are chronically undersecured, and the exposure is massive. I want a proposal on my desk by Friday." Ports, shipping networks, freight tracking. She had no way of knowing that the very industry she was describing was, at that moment, being run by a woman who had built her entire empire around exactly those systems. A woman whose husband also believed she contributed nothing of substance to their household. The universe, it seemed, was already quietly stitching their stories together, long before either woman knew the other existed. That evening, Nyara flew home in time to be standing at the stove when Cassian walked in, tie already loosened, phone still glued to his ear. "No, tell Whitfield we're not moving on the number. He knows what the property's worth." He hung up and dropped his phone on the counter. "Long day. What's for dinner?" "Salmon," she said. "It's almost ready." He sat at the island, rubbing his temples. "You have no idea what it's like. Managing all these people, all these deals. It's exhausting." "I can't imagine," she said, and there was no sarcasm in her voice because she had trained herself, over years, to remove every trace of it. Sarcasm invited conflict, and conflict with Cassian never resolved cleanly. It simply escalated until she was the one apologizing for something she hadn't meant to say. "How was your day?" he asked, not really listening for the answer, already scrolling through something on his phone. "Quiet," she said. "The usual." He didn't look up. He never looked up. And that, more than anything else, was the loneliest part of her life. Not the insults, not the dismissiveness, not even the moments of casual cruelty dressed up as jokes at dinner parties. It was the total absence of curiosity. 14 years married to a man who had never once asked her a question about her inner life with any real intention of hearing the answer. She set his plate in front of him and sat down across the table. And as she watched him eat without a word of thanks, without a glance in her direction, she thought about the folders sitting in a locked drawer in her home office upstairs, the one containing the early paperwork for Ashcroft Sentinel's IPO filing, quietly in progress, that would, within 18 months, make her one of the wealthiest women on the East Coast, entirely independent of anything Cassian Voss had ever touched. She thought about how long she could keep living in two separate worlds before one of them finally cracked open into the other. She didn't yet know the crack was already forming, that Cassian's gambling debts, hidden from her for 3 years through a maze of credit lines and business investments, had reached a number so catastrophic that within weeks he would come to her not with love, not with honesty, but with demands. She didn't know that the breaking point of her marriage was no longer a distant, theoretical possibility. It was already on its way. Zephira's breaking point arrived differently, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through an accumulation of small, sharp indignities that had been sharpening for years, the way water eventually cuts through stone not by force but by patience. It happened at the Coastal Innovators Gala, 3 weeks after the charity dinner where Lucien had called her supportive from the podium. The gala was, ostensibly, a celebration of the very coastal contract he'd been chasing, a contract that Zephira knew, with absolute certainty, existed only because she had quietly steered Voss and Kestrel shipping partnerships toward the municipality in question 8 months earlier, specifically to create the conditions under which Lucien's development firm would look attractive to city planners. She had done this, in part, out of some lingering, dwindling loyalty to the marriage. Some last attempt to help him succeed without ever letting him know she was the reason for his success. She understood, even as she did it, that it was its own kind of quiet madness, engineering a man's victories while he stood on stage thanking everyone but her. That night, Lucien had been drinking more than usual, buoyed by the confirmed contract and the room full of investors applauding his name. Zephira stood near the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, watching him work the room with the easy charisma that had first drawn her to him 15 years ago, before she'd learned that charisma and character were not, in fact, the same thing. Zephira Drayke, said a voice beside her. Genevieve Okafor, a board member from a rival logistics firm. Someone Zephira had met exactly twice at industry events. Someone who had absolutely no idea Zephira sat one boardroom seat away from controlling one of the largest shipping conglomerates on the East Coast. I have to say, your husband's vision for the Riverside project is remarkable. You must be so proud. I am, Zephira said, because it was, in its own strange way, true. She was proud of the buildings. She simply resented that pride had to travel through him to reach the world. It must be wonderful, Genevieve continued, being married to someone so driven. Do you work at all, or? I keep myself busy, Zephira said, the same phrase she'd used for 6 years, the same practice deflection that let people fill in whatever blank they wanted. Charity boards, book clubs, the soft, unthreatening hobbies of a wealthy man's wife. Across the room, Lucien caught her eye and gestured her over with 2 fingers, the same gesture he might use to summon a waiter. She excused herself from Genevieve and crossed the ballroom. And when she reached him, he draped his arm around her shoulders, not affectionately, she noted, but possessively, the way a man drapes his arm around a trophy he once photographed. Say hello to Marcus Kessler, Lucien said. Marcus, this is my wife, Zephira. Marcus Kessler shook her hand, and something about the name snagged briefly in her memory. Kessler, she'd heard that name recently, in a board memo about a fintech firm's security audit, but she couldn't place the context and let it go. Lucien's told me so much about you, Marcus said warmly. Has he? Zephira said, glancing at her husband. Absolutely, Marcus said. Says you're the calm in the storm, the steady hand at home while he builds all this. He gestured broadly at the ballroom, at the gleaming photographs of the Riverside development projected on screens along the walls. Lucien laughed, squeezing her shoulder. That's exactly right. I don't know what I'd do without her holding things together at home. Holding things together at home, as though her entire existence could be summarized as domestic maintenance. As though the boardroom 4 floors above the city where she sat as chairwoman didn't exist. As though the trust her father built, the trust that technically gave her the power to dissolve every partnership Lucien's fame currently relied on with a single signature, was nothing but a rumor in a life she'd never lived. Something in her chest went very still and very cold. If you'll excuse me, she said, I need some air. She walked out onto the terrace, away from the noise and the light, and stood at the railing looking out over the water. The same water, she thought with a bitter, private irony, that the Riverside development would eventually border, the same water that Voss and Kestrel ships moved across every single day, invisible and essential, the way she had made herself invisible and essential for 6 long years. She thought about her father, dying in a hospital bed 11 years earlier, gripping her hand with the last of his strength. Let them underestimate you for as long as it serves you, he'd said. The day it stops serving you, you'll know. Standing on that terrace, the applause and laughter drifting faintly behind her, Zephira Arden understood, with a clarity that felt less like a decision and more like a fact finally arriving at its destination, that the day had come. She just didn't yet know how soon Lucien would give her the final push she needed. The push, when it came, arrived on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks later, delivered not by Lucien directly but by his assistant, a nervous young man named Teddy who clearly hadn't wanted the job of relaying the message and had drawn the short straw regardless. Mrs. Drayke, Teddy said, hovering at the doorway of her home office, Mr. Drayke asked me to let you know he's rescheduling the Voss and Kestrel liaison meeting to next Thursday. He said. Teddy paused, clearly uncomfortable. He said you wouldn't need to attend that one. Camille Foster's going to handle the coastal partnership details going forward. Zephira set down her pen very slowly. Camille Foster. Yes. Mm. She's, she's the new project liaison. Zephira knew exactly who Camille Foster was. 31 years old, formerly a junior associate at a rival development firm, recently and rather suddenly promoted to a senior role within Lucien's company despite limited experience, a promotion Zephira had heard about secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, and had chosen, at the time, not to comment on. She also knew, because she made it her business to know everything that touched even the periphery of Voss and Kestrel's interests, that Camille Foster had been photographed leaving a restaurant with Lucien on 2 separate occasions in the past month, both times under the flimsy cover of project meetings that ran suspiciously late into the evening. "Thank you, Teddy," Zephira said, her voice perfectly level. "That will be all." That night, Lucien came home late, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't his usual brand, and found Zephira sitting at the kitchen table with a single folder placed neatly in front of her. "You're up late," he said, loosening his tie. "I heard Camille Foster is taking over the coastal liaison work." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, Zephira noted with clinical precision, but irritation, the specific irritation of a man who resents being questioned about a decision he'd assumed would pass unnoticed. "She's more available for the day-to-day details," Lucien said. "You've got your charity boards, your whatever it is you do with your time. I need someone who can be hands-on." "Hands-on," Zephira repeated. "Don't make this into something it isn't, Zephira." "I'm not making it into anything. I'm simply noting that you're replacing me with a woman half your age on a project that exists, in part, because of relationships I built." She kept her voice calm, almost pleasant, the same voice she used in board meetings when delivering news that would end careers. Lucien laughed, a short, dismissive sound that landed like a slap. "Relationships you built. Zephira, be serious. You go to lunches. You attend galas. That's not the same as building a business." He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and drank half of it standing at the counter, not even looking at her. "I've spent 15 years building Drayke development from nothing. You spent 15 years being my wife. Those aren't the same job, and I need you to understand that before you start acting like you're entitled to a seat at every table." The words landed and settled, and Zephira felt something in her chest that had been slowly tightening for 6 years finally, quietly, completely close. "You're right," she said softly. "Those aren't the same job." Lucien, mistaking her calm for surrender, nodded, satisfied, and left the kitchen without another word, already checking his phone, already moving on to whatever came next in his evening. Zephira sat alone at the table for a long time after he left. Then she opened the folder in front of her, not a folder of grievances, not a folder of evidence for some future argument, but a folder of instructions carefully drafted 11 years ago by her father's estate attorney, updated annually, waiting patiently for the exact moment she would finally decide to open it. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over a year. "Aldous," she said when the CFO answered, his voice thick with sleep. "I'm sorry to call so late." "Chairwoman," he said, immediately alert, the way people who had served her father learned to be alert the instant they heard that particular tone in her voice. "What do you need?" "I need you to begin activating the succession contingencies," she said. "All of them. Quietly. And immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief but heavy with understanding. "Yes, Chairwoman. I'll have the forensic accountants pull the full audit by end of week." "Thank you, Aldous. May I ask what changed?" Zephira looked toward the closed kitchen door, beyond which she could hear the faint murmur of Lucien's voice on a phone call, laughing at something, probably to Camille, probably about nothing important, probably without a single thought spared for the wife sitting alone in the dark. "Nothing changed," she said quietly. "I simply stopped pretending it hadn't already happened." 2 hours south, in a house that looked, from the outside, nothing like a battlefield, Nyara Ashcroft was learning, in real time, exactly how far her husband's desperation could travel. It started with a phone call she wasn't meant to overhear. She'd come downstairs for water at 11 at night and found Cassian in his study, door slightly ajar, voice tight and low in a way she'd never heard before. Not his usual performative charm, not his golf buddy laugh, but something raw and frightened underneath a thin veneer of control. I understand the deadline, Cassian was saying. I just need another 30 days. I'm good for it. You know I'm good for it. A pause. No, listen. I have assets. I have the house. I have another pause, longer this time. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost pleading. I'll figure it out. Just give me 30 days. Nyara stood in the hallway, glass of water forgotten in her hand, and felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her. She had known, in the vague, half-acknowledged way a person knows something they've chosen not to examine too closely, that Cassian's relationship with money had grown strange over the past year. The sudden, unexplained trips to Atlantic City he called networking, the credit card statements he'd started keeping in a separate drawer, the way he'd grown evasive whenever she asked simple questions about their joint accounts. She had noticed. She had chosen, out of exhaustion or self-preservation or some combination of both, not to push. Now, standing in the hallway at 11 at night, she understood that whatever she had chosen not to see had grown into something enormous while she wasn't looking. She didn't confront him that night. She went back upstairs, lay in bed beside him 2 hours later when he finally came up, and stared at the ceiling in the dark, running silent calculations. In the morning, before he woke, she made 3 phone calls from her car in the driveway, one to her personal attorney, one to the forensic accountant who quietly managed Ashcroft Sentinel's financial audits, and one to a private investigator she'd used once before, years ago, to vet a potential business partner. I need a full financial history, she told the investigator. Discreet. Thorough. I need to know exactly what I'm looking at. The report came back 6 days later, and it was worse than she'd imagined. Cassian had lost, over the past 3 years, just under $4 million, first at private card games with men who called themselves investors, then at a string of increasingly reckless bets on distressed real estate deals that had all collapsed. Then, in the final and most desperate stretch, at an actual casino 2 hours away, where he'd become enough of a regular that the report included a note from a pit boss who'd been paid, apparently, to look the other way about credit extensions. That violated every reasonable lending practice. He had taken out a second mortgage on the house without her signature, forging it. The investigator noted carefully, in a section of the report Nara read 3 times to make sure she understood what she was seeing. He had drained 2 retirement accounts. He had borrowed, at brutal interest rates, against future earnings that existed mostly in his imagination. And now, according to the phone call she'd overheard, someone was calling in the debt, and Cassian Voss, who introduced himself at parties as a self-made investment banker, who called his wife's cybersecurity firm a hobby, who had spent 14 years making Nyara feel small so that he could feel large, was, in fact, on the verge of complete and total financial collapse. She sat with the report for a long time, alone in her home office, the locked drawer containing her IPO paperwork just inches from her hand. She thought about all the years she'd spent making herself smaller to accommodate his ego. All the dinner parties where she'd absorbed his jokes at her expense with a practiced smile. All the Tuesdays she'd spent building an empire he didn't know existed, partly out of caution, and partly, she admitted to herself now, out of some quiet, protective instinct that told her a day like this one might eventually come. She had been right to protect it. She had been right to keep it separate, hidden, untouchable. Because 3 days later, Cassian came to her not with honesty, not with an apology, not with the vulnerability of a man asking for help, but with a demand. He found her in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and before she'd even poured her coffee, he said, without preamble, I need you to sell your equipment. Nyara turned to face him slowly. My equipment. Your little company, whatever you call it. The computer stuff. I need capital, Nyara, and fast, and I know you've got money tucked away somewhere from that consulting thing you do. Consulting thing. 11 years, 412 employees, a government contract portfolio worth more than his entire net worth, reduced in his mouth to that consulting thing. How much do you need? She asked, keeping her voice level, giving nothing away. 4 million, maybe more, depending on how the Kessler deal shakes out. He ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something almost like fear flicker across his face before it hardened back into entitlement. Look, I don't know what you've got saved from your little projects, but whatever it is, it needs to go toward this. We partners, Nyara. What's yours is mine. What's yours is mine, she repeated quietly. Interesting that you've never once applied that principle in the other direction. His jaw tightened. Don't do that. Don't turn this into one of your feminist lectures. I am asking you, as my wife, to help me fix a problem. What problem, Cassian? Tell me exactly what the problem is. He hesitated, and in that hesitation she understood he was calculating how much truth he could afford to give her, how much he could shape the story to make himself the victim rather than the architect of his own collapse. I made some bad investments, he finally said. It happens. I need liquidity, and fast, or we could lose the house. We could lose the house, she said. Or you could lose the house. Which is it, Cassian? Because the second mortgage you took out without my signature suggests you already knew the answer. The silence that followed was total. She watched the color drain from his face, watched him understand, in real time, that she knew more than he'd assumed, that the quiet wife he'd spent 14 years underestimating had, at some point without his noticing, become someone who investigated rather than simply absorbed. You had me investigated, he said slowly. I had myself informed, she corrected. There's a difference. How dare you? How dare I? Her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, rose slightly, not to a shout, never to a shout, but to something with an edge sharp enough to cut. You forged my signature on a mortgage document, Cassian. You gambled away $4 million while calling my career a hobby. And now you're standing in my kitchen demanding I liquidate something you don't even understand exists, to bail out a mess you built entirely on your own. How dare I? For a moment, something almost like shame crossed his face. Then, as it always did, it curdled into something else, a defensive anger that had, over 14 years, become his only real emotional register. I am your husband, he said, and I am telling you that you will help me fix this, or I swear to God, Nyara, I will make your life very difficult. She looked at him, really looked at him, this man she had once believed she loved, this man who had spent over a decade convincing her that her worth was measured entirely by his approval, and she felt, for the first time in 14 years, something close to relief. No, she said simply. Excuse me. No, I will not sell anything to fix a problem you created. I will not liquidate a single asset to cover debts you hid from me. And if you ever forge my signature on another document, I will have you criminally charged. Cassian's hand moved before either of them fully registered what was happening. The slap landed across her cheek with a sound that seemed, for one suspended second, to swallow the entire kitchen, louder than it should have been, echoing off the granite countertops he'd brag about to Marcus and Elaine just weeks earlier. Nyara didn't flinch, didn't cry out, didn't stumble back. She stood perfectly still, one hand rising slowly to touch her burning cheek, and looked at him with an expression that made him take an unconscious step backward. Nyara, he started. Get out, she said quietly. This is my house. Get out of this kitchen. Now. He left. She heard his car peel out of the driveway seconds later, gravel scattering, and only then, alone in the kitchen with the taste of copper faint in her mouth from where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek, did she allow herself to sit down, hands trembling slightly, and process what had just happened. She did not cry. She was somewhat surprised by that herself. Some part of her had expected tears, had braced for them the way you brace for pain after an injury. Instead, what she felt, sitting alone at that kitchen table with a red mark blooming slowly across her cheekbone, was a strange, cold clarity, the kind of clarity that comes only after the last illusion finally, completely burns away. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. It's time, she said. Everything we discussed. I want it moving by Monday. Are you certain? The attorney asked. Nyara touched her cheek again, feeling the heat still radiating from where her husband's hand had made contact, and thought about 11 years of Tuesdays, 412 employees who trusted her, a folder of IPO paperwork locked in a drawer upstairs, and a marriage that had just, in one violent, irreversible instant, told her exactly what it had always been worth. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. 2 hours north, on the same weekend, Lucien Drayke stood at a podium announcing something he believed was a shrewd business decision and had no idea was, in fact, the opening move of his own downfall. Effective next quarter, he told the assembled board of Drayke Development, Camille Foster will be stepping into an expanded senior leadership role, overseeing all coastal partnership initiatives, including our relationship with Voss and Kestrel Logistics. Zephira sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, expression composed, and watched her husband dismantle, piece by piece, the last professional courtesy he'd ever extended to her, not because he understood he was doing it, but precisely because he didn't. He had no idea that Voss and Kestrel Logistics wasn't simply a business partner. He had no idea that the woman he just publicly sidelined controlled the exact company whose cooperation his entire coastal project depended on. "I think this is a smart move," one of the board members offered, glancing briefly, almost apologetically, at Zephira. "Fresh energy on the account." "Absolutely," Lucien said. "Camille brings a level of hunger to this that, frankly, we've been missing." Zephira said nothing. She had learned, over 6 years, that silence in moments like this was not weakness, it was reconnaissance. She watched Camille Foster nod along enthusiastically from her seat near the head of the table, watched Lucien's hand rest briefly, too briefly to be entirely innocent, against the back of Camille's chair, and filed every detail away with the same forensic precision she applied to quarterly shipping reports. After the meeting, as the board filed out, Lucien caught up to her in the hallway, his tone light, almost conciliatory. "You're being very quiet about all this. What would you like me to say, Lucien?" "I don't know. Something supportive, maybe. This is a big project." "I'm sure Camille will handle it beautifully," Zephira said, and something in her voice, some flatness, some finality he was too self-satisfied to properly register, made him pause for just a moment before his phone buzzed and pulled his attention away entirely. "I've got to take this," he said, already walking off. "Dinner tonight. The Hendausens want to celebrate the coastal announcement." "I have a prior engagement," Zephira said. He didn't ask what it was. He never did. That evening, her prior engagement was, in fact, real, a quiet dinner with Aldous Reyes at a restaurant far from the circles Lucien traveled in, where they reviewed, over the course of 2 hours, the full forensic audit of Voss and Kestrel's exposure through its various partnerships, including, prominently, its shipping and logistics agreements with Drayke Development. "The contract renewal is in 90 days, Aldous said, sliding a folder across the table. "As chairwoman, you have full discretion over renewal terms. If you chose not to renew, Drayke Development would lose the coastal partnership entirely," Zephira finished. "And with it, the financing structure the entire Riverside expansion depends on." "Correct." Zephira studied the folder for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling over her not as anxiety but as something closer to certainty, the specific, grounded certainty of a woman finally standing at the exact spot her father had spent a lifetime preparing for her to stand. "Not yet," she said finally. "Let him build a little higher first." Aldous raised an eyebrow. "Chairwoman." "The higher he builds," Zephira said quietly, "the further he'll have to fall. And I want him to understand, completely and without any ambiguity, exactly who allowed him to build at all. If you're feeling that tension building, that's exactly where we want you, because everything that's happened so far, the humiliation, the dismissal, the slap, the quiet phone call to a CFO in the middle of the night, all of it has just been the setup. What comes next is where both of these women stop protecting the men who never protected them and start using 14 years and 6 years of careful, patient preparation. Before we go further, if this story has already pulled you in, take a second to hit that subscribe button, because the reveal scenes coming up are some of the most satisfying moments we've ever told on this channel, and we don't want you to miss a second of it. Cassian Voss filed for divorce 11 days after the slap, and he did it with the confident, almost gleeful energy of a man who believed he was about to solve two problems with a single legal maneuver, end a marriage he'd already emotionally abandoned years earlier, and secure, through community property law, access to whatever mysterious sum of money his wife had apparently been squirreling away under the guise of a consulting business. His attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Pharaoh Whitlock, had assured him the case would be simple. 14 years of marriage, Pharaoh said during their first strategy session, tapping his pen against a legal pad. No prenup. Any assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name they are under, are subject to equitable distribution. If she's been running some kind of business on the side, Cassian, that's marital property. We just need to establish its value. She's been cagey about it, Cassian admitted. Wouldn't tell me numbers. But I've seen the way she carries herself. The trips, the phone calls, the way she disappears on Tuesdays. It's something real. I want everything she's got. Pharaoh smiled the smile of a man who smelled a generous contingency fee. Then let's find out exactly what she's got. What neither of them understood, what Cassian, in his wounded, vindictive certainty, had never bothered to actually investigate, was that Nyara had spent 11 years building Ashcroft Sentinel systems using an entity structure specifically designed, on the advice of an attorney she'd hired before she'd even started dating Cassian, to remain separate from any future marital estate. She had funded the company, in its earliest days, with money inherited directly from her grandmother, money that had never touched a joint account, never been commingled with marital funds, protected from day one by a trust so carefully constructed that even the most aggressive divorce attorney would find it, upon close inspection, entirely untouchable. She had done this not because she'd anticipated, in her 20s, that her marriage would eventually collapse into cruelty and violence. She had done it because her grandmother, the woman whose surname she carried through every business filing, had taught her a lesson early in life. Never build something valuable without first building a wall around it. Men will always tell you what you owe them, her grandmother had said, the summer before she died, sitting on a porch in the fading light. Very few of them will ever ask what they owe you. Build carefully, Nyara. Build quietly. And when the day comes that someone tries to take what's yours, make sure there's nothing left for them to reach. Nyara had listened. And now, 14 years later, sitting across from her own attorney, a formidable woman named Odessa Marchetti who had represented some of the wealthiest women in the state through their most difficult transitions, she felt something like her grandmother's presence settling over the proceedings. "Is going to come after Ashcroft Sentinel," Odessa said, reviewing the discovery request Pharaoh Whitlock's office had filed. "He's requesting full financial disclosure, valuation reports, everything." "Let him request it," Nyara said. "You understand what we're walking into. Once this becomes part of the court record, it becomes public. Reporters will find it. Investors might ask questions." "I've already spoken with my board," Nyara said. "We prepared for visibility. What we are not prepared for is allowing Cassian Voss to seize a single share of a company he has never once shown interest in, contributed to, or even correctly named in a sentence." Odessa smiled, a small, sharp expression that suggested she was going to enjoy this case more than most. "Then let's make sure the court understands exactly what it's looking at." The first hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Fittingly, Nyara thought, the same day of the week she had spent 11 years secretly building the empire now at the center of this legal battle. She dressed carefully that morning, not in the soft, unremarkable clothes she wore to disguise her real life, but in a sharp charcoal suit that Priya had helped her select, the kind of suit a CEO wears when she intends to be recognized as exactly what she is. Cassian arrived at the courthouse with Pharaoh Whitlock at his side, wearing the confident, almost swaggering expression of a man who believed he already knew how this story ended. He glanced at Nyara across the room, taking in the suit, the composed posture, the folder tucked under her arm, and something flickered briefly across his face. Not quite recognition, but the first, faint staring of doubt. "You look different," he said, as they waited for the case to be called. "I look like myself," Nyara replied. "You've simply never bothered to look before." Inside the courtroom, Pharaoh Whitlock rose first, laying out his case with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man accustomed to winning. Your Honor, we're requesting full financial disclosure of all business interests accumulated during the marriage, specifically regarding an entity known as Ashcroft Sentinel Systems, which we believe represents significant marital assets that my client's spouse has attempted to conceal. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Consuelo Reyes Blackwood, who had presided over more high-asset divorces than she could count, turned to Odessa. Counsel. Odessa Marchetti rose, unhurried, and placed a single folder on the table in front of her. Your Honor, my client is prepared to fully disclose the ownership structure of Ashcroft Sentinel Systems. We believe the court will find the matter considerably more straightforward than opposing counsel suggests. Pharaoh, sensing an opening, pressed forward eagerly. Mrs. Voss, perhaps you could tell the court directly. What exactly do you own? The courtroom went quiet. Cassian leaned forward slightly in his seat, and Nyara could see, even from across the room, the anticipation on his face, the belief that whatever number she named, it would be his, half of it, at minimum, a windfall to solve the disaster he created entirely on his own. Nyara rose slowly, opened the folder in front of her, and slid it across the table toward the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying easily through the silent room. I own 100% of Ashcroft Sentinel Systems, a cybersecurity firm founded 11 years ago using inherited funds from my late grandmother's estate, funds that were never commingled with marital assets, and structured, from inception, through an irrevocable trust that predates my marriage to Mr. Voss by 14 months. She let that settle for a moment before continuing. That company currently holds government security clearance contracts, over 140 active patents, and an independent valuation, as of last quarter, of just over $312 million. She paused. None of it is marital property, Your Honor. All documentation is included in the folder before you. The silence that followed was total. Cassian's face went through a rapid, almost comic sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, as the number fully registered, something close to panic. 312 million, Pharaoh Whitlock repeated slowly, staring at the documents the judge's clerk had just handed him, flipping through pages with increasing speed, his earlier confidence visibly draining out of him with every line he read. Your Honor, Odessa said smoothly, we've also included a full accounting of Mr. Voss's undisclosed debts accumulated over the past 3 years, including a forged signature on a second mortgage document, which my client discovered independently and reported, appropriately, to the relevant authorities 2 weeks ago. Cassian shot to his feet. That's not. Nyara, what is this? Mr. Voss, Judge Reyes Blackwood said sharply, you will remain seated, or I will hold you in contempt. He sat, slowly, his face white, and Nyara watched him. This man who had called her hubby a distraction, who had told his friends over mimosas that she'd never contributed financially, who had struck her across the face for refusing to hand over an empire he didn't even know existed, finally, publicly, in the one room where performance and charm couldn't save him, understand exactly what he had lost the moment he'd chosen cruelty over curiosity. We're requesting, Odessa continued, that the court recognize Ashcroft Sentinel Systems as separate, non-marital property in its entirety, and further, that the court take into account the forged mortgage document, along with 3 years of undisclosed gambling debts totaling approximately $4 million, in its determination of equitable distribution regarding the marital home and remaining joint accounts. Judge Reyes Blackwood studied the documents for a long moment, then looked up, first at Nyara, then at Cassian, with an expression that suggested she had seen this particular story before, in different clothes, with different names, more times than she cared to count. I'll be reviewing the full documentation, she said, but based on what's presented here today, Mr. Voss, I would strongly encourage you to reconsider your position before this proceeds any further. The court does not look favorably on attempts to claim assets through fraudulent means, nor does it look favorably on the financial conduct described in this filing. Cassian said nothing. He simply sat there, staring at the folder in Pharaoh Whitlock's hands, watching $312 million evaporate in front of him along with every assumption he'd built his entire marriage on top of. Outside the courthouse, as reporters who had somehow already caught wind of the case began gathering on the steps, drawn by the scent of a story too good to ignore, a self-made investment banker publicly humiliated by a wife he'd called worthless, now revealed as a secret cybersecurity magnate. Nyara paused at the top of the stairs and looked back once at the courthouse doors. She thought about the slap, still faintly tender against her cheekbone if she pressed too hard. She thought about 14 years of small cruelties, disguised as jokes, disguised as concern, disguised as love. She thought about her grandmother on that porch, telling her to build quietly, to build carefully, to make sure that when the day finally came, there would be nothing left for anyone to reach. She had built well, and the day, at long last, had come. News travels fast in certain circles, but it travels fastest through the specific circuitry of people who love watching the powerful stumble. By the following Monday, the story of Cassian Voss, investment banker, husband, gambler, forger, had made its way through 3 different industry newsletters, a regional business journal, and, inevitably, a viral thread on social media that framed the courthouse revelation in exactly the terms that made it irresistible. He called her worthless. She was worth $312 million. Zephira Arden read the article twice over her morning coffee, sitting alone in the kitchen while Lucien showered upstairs, oblivious. She did not know Nyara Ashcroft personally. She had never met the woman. But something in the story, the quiet years, the secret Tuesdays, the folders slid calmly across a courtroom table, settled into her chest with the specific, uncanny resonance of recognition, the way a stranger's story sometimes fits so precisely against the shape of your own life that it feels less like coincidence and more like confirmation. He didn't know, she thought, reading the line again. He spent 14 years not knowing. She thought of Lucien, upstairs, humming to himself in the shower, utterly confident that his coastal contract, his riverside development, his entire empire, belonged to him and him alone. She thought of the 90-day contract renewal window slowly closing. She thought of Camille Foster, smiling enthusiastically at board meetings, completely unaware that the empire she was being groomed to help run existed only because a woman she'd never bothered to properly introduce herself to had quietly financed its every foundation. 90 days had felt, 3 weeks ago, like patience. This morning, reading about Nyara Ashcroft's courtroom reckoning, it suddenly felt like restraint she no longer had any interest in maintaining. She picked up her phone and called Aldous Reyes. "Chairwoman," he answered, slightly surprised. It was barely 7 in the morning. "Everything all right?" "How long would it take," Zephira asked, "to move the contract review date forward?" There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man doing rapid calculations. "Legally, we have full discretion to review at any time within the renewal window. Practically, a week, maybe less, if I prioritize it." "Prioritize it," Zephira said. "And Aldous, I want the full board present. Not a subcommittee, the entire board. May I ask why the urgency, Chairwoman?" Zephira looked out the kitchen window at the pale morning light spreading over the water, the same water her father's first 3 trucks had once driven parallel to, decades before glass towers and quarterly earnings calls, back when Voss and Kestrel Logistics was nothing but a stubborn man's conviction that he could move the world's goods more honestly than anyone else was willing to. "Because I've spent 6 years being patient," she said, "and patience, I've realized, is not the same thing as weakness. But it isn't a virtue forever, either." The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning, and Lucien Drayke, informed only that Voss and Kestrel has requested an accelerated contract review, arrived at the glass tower with the easy, unbothered confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility that anything in his professional life might not go exactly according to his expectations. He was dressed impeccably, as always, a navy suit, a watch that cost more than most people's cars, the specific, gleaming self-assurance of a man who had spent 15 years being told, by everyone around him, that he was exactly as impressive as he believed himself to be. Camille Foster walked beside him, a leather folio tucked under her arm, reviewing notes on her tablet, occasionally glancing up to offer Lucien a reassuring smile that suggested she, too, had no idea what was about to happen. They approached the reception desk on the executive floor, and Lucien offered the receptionist his most charming smile, the smile he used on investors, on journalists, on anyone he needed to like him quickly. Lucien Drayke, here for the 9 o'clock with the board. The receptionist, a young woman whose name tag read Sasha, glanced at her screen, then back up at him with an expression of polite, professional discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mr. Drayke. It looks like your building access expired 23 minutes ago." Lucien laughed, assuming a glitch. "That can't be right. I've got a meeting." "I understand, sir, but the system shows your credentials were deactivated this morning. I need someone from the board to authorize your access before I can let you through." "Deactivated," Lucien repeated, the charm in his voice thinning, just slightly, at the edges. "By whom?" Sasha glanced down at her screen again, clearly uncomfortable delivering this particular piece of information. "The authorization came directly from the chairwoman's office, sir." "The chairwoman," Lucien said slowly. "There's no chairwoman. Voss and Kestrel is run by a board." Sasha said nothing, because it was not, technically, her job to explain corporate governance structures to visibly confuse visitors, and because she had been specifically instructed, that morning, not to elaborate further. Camille Foster, beside him, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Lucien and the reception desk with a growing unease of someone realizing, in real time, that the ground beneath a meeting she'd prepared meticulously for had just quietly disappeared. "This is ridiculous," Lucien said, pulling out his phone. "I'll call Marcus. He'll sort this out." Before he could dial, the elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed, and the doors slid open. Aldous Reyes stepped out, flanked by 2 members of building security, his expression carefully, deliberately neutral. "Mr. Drayke," he said, "if you'll follow me, the board is ready to see you. Just you. However, Ms. Foster will need to wait here." "Wait here?" Camille said, startled. "I'm the project liaison. I should be present for." The board's request was specific, Aldous said, not unkindly, but without room for negotiation. "Mr. Drayke only." Lucien, still processing the deactivated credentials, the strange formality, the unfamiliar name, the chairwoman, followed Aldous toward the elevator with the particular stiff-back confusion of a man trying very hard to project confidence he no longer entirely felt. The elevator ride to the top floor took 40 seconds, and in that 40 seconds, Lucien ran through every possible explanation his mind could generate. A miscommunication, a scheduling error, some junior employee's overzealous security protocol that would be laughed off within minutes of him walking into the room and charming his way through it, the way he charmed his way through everything. The elevator doors opened onto the executive boardroom, and Lucien stepped out into a room he had visited a handful of times over the years, always as a guest, always briefed in advance, always shaking hands with board members who greeted him with a polite, professional warmth reserved for a valuable business partner. Today, the room was already full. 12 board members seated around the long mahogany table, folders open in front of them, expressions composed into a stillness that Lucien, even in his confusion, recognized as deliberate. And at the head of the table, in the chair that had sat empty in his memory every single time he'd been in this room, sat his wife. Zephira Arden wore a charcoal suit he had never seen before, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded on the table in front of her with the composed authority of someone who had occupied that exact seat for years, long before this particular morning, long before Lucien had ever set foot in this building. For a long moment, Lucien simply stood in the doorway, unable to process what he was looking at, his mind scrambling to reconcile the woman he'd left in bed that morning. The woman he'd told, in passing, over coffee, not to wait up because the coastal celebration dinner might run late. With a woman now sitting at the head of a boardroom table that controlled, he was beginning to understand with a dawning, sickening clarity, considerably more than he'd ever imagined. As he stood there, frozen, every board member in the room rose from their seats. Not for him. For her. "Please," Zephira said quietly, gesturing to the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Sit down, Lucien." He sat, because his legs, quite honestly, did not seem to be offering him any other option. "I imagine," Zephira continued, her voice calm, measured, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent years rehearsing this exact composure in rooms exactly like this one. "You have some questions." "Zephira," Lucien said, his voice cracking slightly on her name. "What is this? What's happening?" "This," she said, "is Voss and Kestrel Logistics. My father founded it 43 years ago with 3 trucks and a conviction that honest work outlasts dishonest ambition. When he died 11 years ago, he left it to me, not as a figurehead, not as a name on a document, but as chairwoman, with full voting control over 68% of the company, held through a succession trust he structured specifically to protect it from anyone who might one day try to claim it without having built a single piece of it themselves." Lucien stared at her. 68%. 68%, she confirmed. "Which means, Lucien, that every partnership your development firm has secured through this company over the past 6 years, the port access, the shipping logistics, the coastal contract you celebrated 3 weeks ago in front of a room full of people who applauded you for a vision that was never entirely yours to begin with, every single one of those relationships existed because I allowed them to exist. You never told me. You never asked," Zephira said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a vast, quiet exhaustion that somehow landed harder than fury would have. "In 6 years of marriage, Lucien, you never once asked me a single question about my father's company that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite dismissal. You called my board meetings lunches. You called my quarterly reviews charity work. You told a room full of investors, 3 weeks ago, that I hold things together at home, as though the coastal contract you were celebrating hadn't been engineered, specifically, by the wife you just quietly replaced with a woman half her age." Camille's name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Several board members shifted almost imperceptibly in their seats. That's a business decision, Zephira. It has nothing to do with." "I'm not finished," Zephira said, and something in her tone, still quiet, still measured, but unmistakably final, made Lucien close his mouth. "You removed me from the coastal liaison role you believed I had no real claim to, on a project you believed you had built entirely through your own vision, financed by relationships you never once bothered to understand the origin of. You did this in front of your board, without a private conversation, without a moment of basic courtesy, because in 6 years of marriage, you never once considered that I might be owed one." She opened the folder in front of her and slid a single document down the length of the table until it stopped directly in front of Lucien. "This is the current status of Drayke Development's financing structure," she said. "As you'll see, roughly 40% of your active capital is secured through credit lines backed, indirectly, by Voss and Kestrel shipping partnerships and port access agreements. The coastal contract you celebrated 3 weeks ago exists entirely because I quietly redirected our logistics investments toward that municipality 8 months in advance, specifically to make your firm's bid competitive." Lucien stared down at the document, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through pages of financial architecture he was seeing, for the first time, laid bare in its entirety. A business empire he had believed, with complete and unexamined confidence, belonged entirely to his own vision and effort, revealed instead as a structure quietly scaffolded, at every critical juncture, by a wife he'd spent years calling decorative. "Effective this morning," Zephira continued, Voss and Kestrel Logistics is declining to renew its shipping and port access agreements with Drayke Development at the end of the current contract term. You will find, in the accompanying documentation, 90 days' notice, as required by the existing contract terms. 90 days, Lucien repeated, his voice hollow. "Zephira, without that access, the Riverside project, the coastal contract, will likely collapse," Zephira said, finishing the sentence he couldn't bring himself to complete. "Yes, I'm aware. You can't do this. This is spite. This is a business decision," Zephira said, echoing his own words back to him with a precision that landed like a blade, made by the chairwoman of a company whose resources you relied on without ever acknowledging their true source. I would remind you, Lucien, that you told me those weren't the same job. Being your wife and building a business. You were right. They aren't. And I've decided, after 6 years, that I'm only interested in doing one of them. The room was utterly silent. Board members who had known this day was coming, who had watched Zephira's careful, patient stewardship over the years, who had understood long before Lucien ever would that the quiet woman at the edge of every gala photo was, in fact, the axis on which this entire company turned, sat with expressions ranging from quiet satisfaction to careful, professional neutrality. I'm also filing for divorce, Zephira added, almost as an afterthought, though both of them understood it was nothing of the sort. My attorney will be in touch with yours. I'd encourage you to review the terms of our prenuptial agreement closely. You'll find it was drafted, at my father's insistence, with considerably more foresight than you likely remember. Lucien sat frozen at the far end of the table, the document trembling faintly in his hands, watching his empire, the empire he had spent 15 years believing he'd built alone, brick by brick, deal by deal, through nothing but his own charisma and vision, dissolve in front of him with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a woman who had simply, finally, stopped protecting him from a truth he'd never once bothered to ask about. Aldous will escort you out, Zephira said. I believe you have a celebration dinner to attend tonight. I understand the Hendersons are quite eager to hear how the coastal project is progressing. If you've been holding your breath through that boardroom scene, let it out now. Because that's the moment this entire story has been building toward, and we still have consequences and redemption still ahead. If you're new here, drop a like and subscribe, because we tell stories exactly like this one every week. Stories about the quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones who were building something enormous the entire time nobody was paying attention. Tell us in the comments, which reveal hit harder for you, the courtroom folder or the boardroom door that wouldn't open? The weeks that followed unfolded with the particular, merciless speed of consequences that had been patiently accumulating for years finally arriving all at once. Cassian Voss's divorce proceedings, once the courtroom revelation became public record, took on a life entirely outside his control. The forged mortgage document, once flagged in the divorce filing, triggered a separate criminal investigation, mortgage fraud. The district attorney's office called it, and though Cassian's attorney negotiated a plea deal that spared him prison time in exchange for restitution and probation, the damage to his professional reputation proved far less negotiable. His investment fame, already uneasy about the gambling debt surfacing in the divorce filing, quietly asked him to take an indefinite leave of absence that everyone involved understood would never actually end. Investors who had trusted him with their portfolios began, one by one, withdrawing their accounts, unwilling to remain associated with a man now publicly known for financial recklessness and fraud. He lost the house, not through the divorce settlement itself, since Nyara, through Odessa Marchetti, negotiated a resolution that left Cassian responsible for the second mortgage debt he'd fraudulently incurred, but through the simple, grinding reality of a man with no income and mounting legal fees. He moved into a rented apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place he would once have described, dismissively, as beneath him, and spent his evenings scrolling through old photos of galas and dinner parties where he'd once been, in his own mind, the most impressive person in the room. Lucien Drayke's collapse was slower, more public, and in some ways more thorough. Without the port access and shipping partnerships Voss and Kestrel had quietly provided, the Riverside development stalled within weeks, financing partners growing nervous as delays mounted and the coastal contract he'd celebrated so triumphantly began to visibly unravel. His board, sensing the shift, moved swiftly and without sentiment. Within 2 months, Lucien was voted out as CEO of his own company, replaced by a managing partner who had, notably, spent years quietly cultivating relationships with Voss and Kestrel's leadership independent of Lucien's involvement. An internal audit, launched shortly after his removal, uncovered a pattern of misused company funds, expensive dinners, undisclosed gifts, and a series of payments to Camille Foster that bore little resemblance to any legitimate business expense. Camille, facing her own scrutiny, resigned within days and left the city entirely, and Lucien, watching the last remnants of both his empire and his affair collapse in the same news cycle, found himself, for the first time in 15 years, entirely without an audience willing to applaud him. Neither man, in the aftermath, understood what had actually happened to them. Cassian told anyone who would listen that Nyara had tricked him, had hidden an entire company from her own husband out of some cold, calculated cruelty. Lucien insisted, to the handful of old friends who still returned his calls, that Zephira had sabotaged him, had used her father's company as a weapon the moment their marriage grew inconvenient. Neither man ever quite reached the understanding that might have actually helped them, that they had not been betrayed by secrecy, but exposed by their own refusal to ever look closely enough to see what had been standing quietly beside them the entire time. Nyara and Zephira, for their part, did not celebrate. Nyara spent the months following her divorce settlement doing exactly what she had always done best, building. With the immediate threat of the divorce resolved and her ownership of Ashcroft Sentinel systems fully protected, she turned her attention, for the first time in 11 years, towards something beyond quarterly growth and government contracts. She sat in her office one evening, several weeks after the final settlement, reviewing a proposal Priya had drafted at her request, a scholarship fund, seeded with an initial $10 million from her personal holdings, designed to support young women entering cybersecurity and technology fields, particularly those from backgrounds where mentorship and access had historically been scarce. The Sullen Foundation, Priya suggested, reading the draft aloud. After your middle name. Nyara considered it for a moment, then shook her head. The Ashcroft Foundation, she said. My grandmother's name got me through the hardest years of building this company in secret. It should be the name that helps the next generation build in the open. The foundation launched 3 months later, and within its first year, it had funded scholarships, mentorships, and paid internships for over 300 young women across 11 states. Nyara, who had spent over a decade hiding her ambition behind soft cardigans and quiet Tuesdays, found herself, for the first time, standing on stages introducing herself not as someone's wife, not as a woman who dabbled in something technical, but simply, finally, as herself, founder, CEO, and now, philanthropist, building something that would outlast every insult that had ever tried to make her smaller. She did not remarry, not in the years immediately following the divorce, though she was not, as certain tabloids speculated, closed off to the idea of love. She had simply learned, through 14 difficult years, the precise difference between a partnership and a performance, and she found she was in no hurry to mistake one for the other ever again. Zephira's path toward rebuilding took a different shape, though it carried the same underlying conviction, that the years of being underestimated should be transformed into something that made underestimation harder for the next generation of women to survive. She launched the Voss Foundation for Financial Independence 8 months after the divorce was finalized, structured specifically to help survivors of domestic and financial abuse rebuild their lives through business grants, legal education, and, crucially, financial literacy training designed to help women recognize and protect assets before a crisis forced them to. I had my father's trust, she told a room of survivors at the foundation's inaugural event, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of what she was about to share publicly for the first time. I had lawyers and resources, and 11 years of preparation most women in this situation will never have access to. I built something protected because I was fortunate enough to be taught, early, that protection matters. Not every woman gets that lesson in time. This foundation exists to make sure more of you do. The room, filled with women who had walked into abusive or exploitative marriages with far fewer resources than Zephira had inherited, listened with the particular, rapt attention of people finally hearing their own story reflected back to them by someone who understood it from the inside. Under her full leadership, unencumbered now by the careful diplomatic dance she'd maintained for years to avoid overshadowing a husband who had never deserved the accommodation, Voss and Kestrel Logistics expanded aggressively. Newport partnerships, an ambitious sustainability initiative that reduced the company's carbon footprint by nearly a third within 18 months, and a mentorship pipeline that placed dozens of young women over the following 2 years into leadership roles across the logistics and shipping industry, an industry that had, for generations, operated almost entirely under male leadership. She thought of her father often in those years, not with grief exactly, though grief remained, quietly, somewhere underneath everything else, but with a growing, settled gratitude for the patience he'd shown in building her a fortress before she ever understood she would need one. 18 months after Nyara Ashcroft slid a folder across a courtroom table, and roughly 16 months after Zephira Arden watched an entire boardroom rise for her instead of the man who had walked in expecting deference, the two women finally met, not by careful design, not through some elaborate plan orchestrated by either of them, but through the simple, almost anticlimactic mechanism of both being invited to speak at the same international summit on women in business, held that year in a glass-walled conference center overlooking a harbor neither of them had ever visited together before. Nyara arrived first, reviewing her notes for the keynote she'd been asked to deliver, a talk on building protected value in an era of financial vulnerability, drawn directly, though the organizers didn't fully know it, from her own 11 years of careful, secretive construction. She stood near the edge of the stage, going over her opening lines, when a voice beside her, calm and warm, said, "I read about you." The courtroom, the folder. Nyara turned, and found herself looking at a woman she recognized instantly, though they had never met. The elegant, composed features from a dozen news photographs, the same quiet authority she'd read about in an article, months earlier, about a boardroom in a glass tower 2 hours away, about a man denied access to a building he believed he was entitled to walk into freely. "Zephira Arden," Nyara said. "Nyara Ashcroft," Zephira replied, extending her hand. "I have to admit, when I read your story, I nearly called you. It felt strange, reading about a woman I'd never met, and recognizing so much of my own life in the details." "I felt the same way about yours," Nyara said, shaking her hand. "The boardroom door, the security access. I remember thinking, someone else understands exactly what it feels like to build something enormous in complete silence." They stood together for a long moment, two women who had spent years living entirely different lives in entirely different industries, bound together by an experience so specific, so quietly devastating, that most people around them would never fully understand its shape. The particular loneliness of being brilliant and unseen, of building empires in the hours when the men who claimed to love them assumed they were doing nothing at all. "Did you ever wonder," Zephira asked, "what would have happened if we'd told them sooner? If we'd simply said, at some point, early on, this is what I've built, this is what I'm capable of?" Nyara considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things. "I used to wonder that," she admitted. "But I don't anymore. I don't think it would have mattered. Men like that don't respond to honesty with respect. They respond to it with fear, or resentment, or an attempt to claim it as their own. The silence wasn't cowardice. It was armor. I needed the armor to finish building before anyone tried to take it apart." "Yes," Zephira said softly. "Exactly that." The summit organizers called them both toward the stage a few minutes later, and as they walked together through the wings, cameras already beginning to flash from the audience beyond the curtain, Nyara glanced sideways at the woman beside her. This stranger who had become, in the span of a single conversation, something closer to a sister than most people she'd known for years, and felt a quiet, unexpected warmth settle over the morning. "Funny," Nyara said, smiling as they reached the edge of the stage. "They called us quiet." Zephira's answering smile was slow and certain, and carried within it every year of patient, careful construction that had led both of them to this exact moment. "Silence gave us time to build," she said. They walked onto the stage together, side by side, into a wall of applause that neither of them had ever needed to earn the love of a man to receive. Cameras flashed. The audience rose, first in scattered pockets and then, within seconds, entirely to its feet. Hundreds of people, many of them women who had spent their own lives being underestimated in smaller, quieter, less dramatic ways, recognizing something in the two women on stage that felt less like celebrity and more like permission. Nyara looked out over the crowd, thinking of 11 years of Tuesdays, of a slap that had finally, mercifully, ended 14 years of shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's comfort. Zephira looked out over the same crowd, thinking of a father's hand gripping hers in a hospital room, of a boardroom door that had finally opened onto the exact life he'd spent decades quietly preparing her to claim. Neither woman spoke of revenge that day. When asked, later, by an interviewer eager for a triumphant, vindictive quote, what she would say to the husbands who had once called them worthless, Zephira answered simply, "I'd tell them I hope they eventually learn to actually see the people beside them. Not for my sake, for the sake of whoever comes next." Nyara, asked the same question moments later, offered a version of the same grace. "I don't think about him much anymore," she said. Which is, I think, the most honest form of closure there is. Not anger, just distance, and a life that finally has room to be entirely mine. The story that had begun in two separate kitchens, in two separate cities, with two separate women quietly absorbing insults they had long since stopped believing, ended not with fire, not with dramatic confrontation, but with two women standing together on a stage, having built, patiently, secretly, relentlessly, lives too large for the men who had once tried to convince them they were worth nothing at all. Fade to black. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments which part hit hardest. Was it the courtroom folder, the boardroom doors that wouldn't open, or the final scene where two strangers recognized themselves in each other? Stories like this remind us that quiet doesn't mean powerless, and worthless is never a word that belongs to anyone who's still building. Subscribe if you want more stories about the women who were underestimated and came back stronger than anyone imagined. We've got more waiting for you.